In this lecture, we're going to talk about the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lung, how oxygen moves from lung air into capillary blood, and how carbon dioxide moves from the blood to the air in the lung and then is removed from the body. There's only 3 slides. 2 provide information, 1 provides an example to tie things together. But you'll find there's quite a lot of information. So as you approach these few slides, make sure that you understand the abbreviations. If you find yourself looking at P lowercase a02 and you really don't know what it means, stop, go back, make sure you know what it means. Then make sure that you're understanding the concepts, how these gases are exchanged. I want you, of course, to remember that pulmonary ventilation and the lungs themselves are both things of beauty, and you're going to have to memorize a few numbers. Once you memorize the numbers, it'll make it easier for you to understand the abbreviations and the concepts, or perhaps it works the other way, I'm not sure. Memorize some numbers, know the abbreviations, understand the concepts. Here we go. Oxygen exchange. We breathe air into the lungs. It is full of oxygen. The oxygen diffuses. It is transported from that air into the pulmonary capillary blood, and then it's pumped by the heart to all parts of the body, to the muscles. So we'll be talking about diffusion of oxygen from the lung air to the capillary blood, and diffusion of a gas occurs along a partial pressure gradient. As a reminder, partial pressure is calculated as the percent concentration times the total pressure, usually the barometric pressure. And if we're talking room air, the barometric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. If you watch the weather, you might hear that the barometric pressure is around 29.9 inches, 30 inches, 760 millimeters. The percentage of the air that is oxygen is about 21. So the air is 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen. So the partial pressure of oxygen in room air, in ambient air, is 159 millimeters of mercury, 21% times 760. Now here are a few of those abbreviations. Let's just go through the abbreviations first. These are 3 partial pressures. The lowercase v, the subscript that is a lowercase v, stands for venous. So this is the partial pressure of oxygen, the amount of oxygen in blood returning to the heart and the lung. Skip one. Lowercase a is arterial. So this is the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood as it leaves the lung and then is pumped away from the heart. So the first and the third, the ones with the subscripts that are lowercase, refer to the blood. Venous blood, arterial blood. And now if you look at the numbers, blood coming back to the heart has 40 millimeters of mercury worth of oxygen, but when it leaves, it has 100 millimeters of mercury. So it has picked up oxygen in the lung. You knew that. Now, here's how it works. That middle abbreviation, PaO2, where the A is capitalized, this refers to the alveoli or the alveoli. I don't know which you prefer. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the lung is 100 millimeters of mercury. 2 things. First, blood returning to the lung has a partial pressure of 40. There's a very thin membrane between the capillary and the alveoli, where the partial pressure is 100. So we have a diffusion gradient or a partial pressure gradient. So oxygen is going to move from where there's a lot of it, the alveoli, into where there is less, the blood. It moves from 100 to 40. And then as the blood leaves, it has reached an equilibrium so that its partial pressure is equivalent to the partial pressure of the alveoli. Now, the second point, that alveolar air just got breathed in from the outside air. Outside air has a partial pressure of 159. Air in the alveolus has a partial pressure of 100. Why the difference? 3 reasons. Think of lung air as being a mixture of fresh, new air that's coming in from outside and some leftover, what I call old air, air that has been in the lung and isn't flushed out with each breath. And we don't empty the alveoli completely with each breath. We remove some of the air and bring some fresh air in. So we have a mixture of fresh air, where the partial pressure is 159, and old air, where the partial pressure is lower. So why is the partial pressure lower specifically? 1, as we breathe air in, we add water vapor to it. Now, water vapor is a gas, so it takes up a percentage of the total pressure. Remember I said room air is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen? That's pretty dry. There's no water in it. But if we add water, then the percentage of oxygen is going to go down. And therefore, the partial pressure of oxygen will go down. Second, we're adding carbon dioxide to it. So some of the old air has carbon dioxide that's been added to it from the body. And then the third thing is we're taking oxygen out. So some of the old air has had some oxygen removed. So we got 3 effects. We're adding water, adding carbon dioxide, removing oxygen, so that the partial pressure on average in the alveoli is 100 millimeters of mercury. Now, I say on average. The air in the alveoli is constantly being flushed, if you will. Old air being removed, new air coming in, carbon dioxide being added, oxygen being removed, water being added. So you've got a constantly changing picture, and we're taking a snapshot of it. So that P capital A, the alveolar PaO2, is a fuzzy snapshot of a dynamic situation. But it describes quite well what the alveoli look like on average, why we have a diffusion gradient, and what arterial blood looks like as it leaves the heart and lung. Now here's a thought. If we breathe normally, that alveolar partial pressure is going to stay constant at 100 millimeters of mercury. I'm just telling you that. If you're exercising, then what happens to that middle partial pressure? What happens to the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli? I'll give you a moment to think. Ready? The answer is nothing. I just told you. If you breathe normally, that partial pressure will remain the same. All right, here's an easy one. And I think we've already talked about this. What happens to the arterial partial pressure of oxygen in exercise? I'll give you a moment. Ready? It stays the same. We've just said partial pressure in the arteries is going to be the same as the partial pressure in the alveoli. They both stay the same. Question number 3. During exercise, what happens to the partial pressure of oxygen in the venous blood? I'll give you a moment. What happens to the partial pressure of oxygen in the venous blood? Ready? It goes down. Blood is coming back from the muscles where we're using oxygen, extracting more oxygen. So the partial pressure of oxygen in blood returning to the lung will be lower, which means the gradient will be greater, which means there's going to be more of a drive for oxygen to move from the air to the blood, which is a good thing because we need more. So everything works out well. That is oxygen exchange. Now carbon dioxide exchange. Very similar. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the ambient air is virtually 0. Percentage of carbon dioxide in room air, 0.03%. Okay, there is virtually no carbon dioxide in room air. Now, given that fact, as you look down at the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolar air, P subscript capital A, CO2, it's 40 millimeters of mercury. That tells you that there's quite a bit of old air in the lung because fresh air coming in has no oxygen, and yet air in the lung has this 40 millimeters of mercury. So there's a lot of old air which has already received carbon dioxide from the blood. The third abbreviation there, arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide, of course, is the same as the alveolar partial pressure, 40 millimeters of mercury. And the last number to look at, PvCO2, what happens or how much carbon dioxide is in blood returning to the lung? Well, simply put, more than when the blood leaves the lung. So carbon dioxide is being removed from the blood. Carbon dioxide is moving along a partial pressure gradient of 46 to 40. Couple of points. One, you might look at that and go, geez, that's not much of a gradient, 46 to 40. Remember the previous one for oxygen? It was 100 to 40. That's a lot of driving pressure, if you will. Here, the difference is very small. Ooh, what happens if we don't bring in enough oxygen, as much oxygen as we would like to the body? What happens? We don't get as much oxygen as we would like. We're going to have to slow down. Maybe get some energy from anaerobic pathways. What happens if we don't get rid of the carbon dioxide that we need to get rid of? Well, if you go back to my favorite equation, you'll become acidotic and die. So, golly, it's really important that we get rid of this carbon dioxide, and we have a very small diffusion gradient, but don't be concerned, the lung is designed to get rid of carbon dioxide. That's what it does best. So it functions very well with only this small gradient. What happens in exercise? PA alveolar and PA arterial CO2 levels stay the same. If anything, let's not go there. They stay the same. They do not increase, which means we are getting rid of the carbon dioxide. PvCO2 will be higher because we're producing a lot of carbon dioxide in the muscles. And let me ask you, through what process do we produce carbon dioxide in the muscles? Okay, that's one. What's the other one? I hope you said aerobic oxidative phosphorylation. And if we're in severe intensity exercise and we're buffering, then from buffering we produce excess carbon dioxide. All right, so in exercise, our values, if you will, the important value, arterial CO2, stays the same. I started to say that I'll finish it. If anything, it goes down a little bit. So if anything, we're getting rid of a little more carbon dioxide than we normally do, and that's a good thing. Now, how do I maintain this arterial PaCO2 if I'm bringing more carbon dioxide back to the lung and dumping more carbon dioxide into the lung? How do I get rid of it? By breathing more, by flushing out the air faster, by breathing faster and deeper. Well, I can also hyperventilate even though I'm not exercising. And what will happen? Well, in exercise, I hyperventilate to keep things in the lung looking normal. At rest, if I hyperventilate, so this could be either voluntary hyperventilation, I just choose to breathe faster and deeper, or it could be hyperventilation caused by fear or pain or panic. If I hyperventilate at rest, I'm going to make my lung air look more like room air. So alveolar PCO2 could look like 0. Now, look at the diffusion gradient. Huge, from 46 to 0. So carbon dioxide is going to move in large amounts from the blood to the alveolar air, where the partial pressure is 0. And then the PaCO2 will be lower. It will approach 0. So by voluntary hyperventilation, I can reduce partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood. That can have a serious effect on the body via, my favorite equation, via the buffering equation. Now I want you to take a moment and do two things. Write out my favorite equation, write out the buffering equation, and then imagine what will happen if you remove carbon dioxide from the blood. If by this voluntary hyperventilation I blow off carbon dioxide, if I reduce the PaCO2 to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood, what will the effect be? Okay, 1, write down the buffering equation. 2, what is the effect of reducing carbon dioxide? I'll give you a moment. You may want to pause this. Okay, I'm ready with the answer. If you're still working on it, pause this. What will voluntary hyperventilation cause? It will pull the reaction to the right. It'll reduce the number of hydrogen ions. Your pH will go up. Your blood will become alkalotic. You will experience respiratory alkalosis. And this is a common side effect of pain, among other things. That would be an involuntary hyperventilation, but a non-exercise hyperventilation resulting in respiratory alkalosis and clearly upsetting the body's acid-base balance. Now you may say, why don't we talk about the effect of voluntary hyperventilation on oxygen levels? And the fact is that voluntary hyperventilation, making lung air look more like room air, means the alveolar PO2 will increase, so the arterial PO2 will increase. But as you shall see in our third lecture, that really doesn't much matter. The main effect of this voluntary hyperventilation is blowing off carbon dioxide. On the next slide, I'll give you an example of this, the effects of this voluntary hyperventilation specific to carbon dioxide. I don't know if you've ever played the game of how long can you stay underwater, a kiddie favorite. Well, let's look at what happens when you do go underwater. You are, of course, moving slowly just to maintain your position underwater. So levels of oxygen, that's shown in white starting from the top left, levels of oxygen in the arterial blood will gradually decrease. Because even though you're not exercising hard, you're living, you're exercising a little, so you're using up some oxygen, withdrawing it from the arterial blood. So the levels will gradually come down, and at some point, and I've shown here somewhere around 4 minutes, this certainly isn't me as the example, but I've just said somewhere around 4 minutes, the oxygen receptors in the arteries, the oxygen receptors say, hey, oxygen levels are too low, and they will send a message to the brain. However, the messages from the oxygen receptors are not very powerful, and I'm not even going to talk about them anymore after this. The real key is the carbon dioxide receptors. So I've shown here in yellow that the carbon dioxide levels gradually increase, aerobic oxidative phosphorylation, you're using up some oxygen, carbon dioxide is being produced, and I've shown here that at the 3-minute mark, the carbon dioxide receptors react, and they say carbon dioxide levels are too high. They send the message up to the brain, to the respiratory center, and the respiratory center then sends the message we have to breathe more. And that's when you get this panic. We've got to breathe more. We've got to get to the surface. And so the kid comes up, and he's, in this case, gone just over 3 minutes staying underwater. Well, he has heard that if you hyperventilate before you go underwater, you can stay under longer. So the next time he plays the game, he hyperventilates. Now remember from the previous slide, voluntary hyperventilation reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the lung, makes it look like room air, reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the lung, and therefore reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood. So in the lower left-hand corner of this slide, the PaCO2 now, after hyperventilation, will be much lower, and as the young fellow stays underwater, it will very gradually increase, just like it did before, except it's starting from a lower point. So is this working? Yes. Our young fellow has gone 10 minutes before the levels of carbon dioxide in the blood reach threshold levels, and the carbon dioxide receptors send a message up to the brain, to the respiratory center, up to the respiratory center in the brain. Now the brain, of course, uses oxygen. And if we look at this young man's oxygen levels, they have gradually, young boy, I'll say, the oxygen levels have gradually been decreasing and decreasing and decreasing, and after 10 minutes or so, the oxygen levels may be so low that there's not enough oxygen being sent to the brain. So the respiratory center in the brain may get a message from the carbon dioxide receptors, but it's not functioning anymore because it hasn't been receiving enough oxygen. So even though the message gets to the brain, there is no message from the brain saying we've got to breathe. So there is no panic. There is no panic to thrash up to the top of the surface, or the surface of the water. In fact, kids, well, so there's no drive to breathe, so you don't breathe, so you have no oxygen, and then you die. And apparently, obviously I've never seen this, kids drown happy. Well, I'm setting a new personal best in the how long can you stay underwater game. I have no drive to breathe. And then no oxygen to the brain, and then they die. So it works. Don't do this at home. Don't let kids do this. It works. If you're really good at hyperventilating, you can stay underwater until the lifeguard sees you lying on the bottom of the pool. It works. It's incredibly dangerous. Don't do it. Don't let kids do it. But remember the lesson so you know one of the factors that can drive ventilation is this reduced partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood. And remember the effects of ventilation, hyperventilation, that you make the room air come into the body. And by hyperventilating, you can make lung air look even more like room air, which can have some important, serious, deadly repercussions, especially with respect to carbon dioxide. And finally, just a couple of slides to explain oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. We also had a slide showing the effect of hyperventilation. And next time we'll talk about how, once the oxygen gets into the blood, how it's carried. So we'll be talking about hemoglobin. We'll talk only very briefly about how carbon dioxide is carried in the blood. And then we'll also talk about how the delivery of oxygen is related to oxygen uptake and utilization in the body. So we will be talking about the Fick equation. So you can be thinking about hemoglobin from your biology classes and think about the famous Fick equation from a couple of lectures ago. All for now.